Welcome to AI True Crime, where we dive deep into the shadows of history to explore the stories that have shaped the world we know today. Today, we're peeling back the layers of one of America's most notorious districts, the Barbary Coast of San Francisco. In this episode, we'll journey back to a time when the city by the bay was a chaotic cauldron of vice, crime, and unbridled human desire. The Barbary Coast wasn't just a place, it was an idea, a magnet for those chasing fortune or running from their pasts. It's a story of gamblers, prostitutes, crimps, and vigilantes, set against the backdrop of a city bursting into the modern world with all the fervor and lawlessness of the gold rush era. The Barbary Coast's legacy is complex, filled with tales of boldness, exploitation, and a moral ambiguity that often left the city teetering on the edge of anarchy. It was a district where the rules were few and the stakes were high, a place where the pursuit of wealth and pleasure could easily turn into a descent into violence and despair. Throughout this episode, we'll explore the rise and fall of the Barbary Coast, unraveling the stories of those who lived, thrived, and perished within its confines. From the first whisper of gold in the California hills to the final efforts to cleanse the city of its notorious underworld, the Barbary Coast is a chapter of American history you won't soon forget. To fully appreciate the Barbary Coast's significance, we must start at the beginning, before the Barbary Coast was even a concept, before San Francisco was a bustling city. We need to go back to 1848, to a time when California was a land of promise on the edge of the known world, a place where fortunes lay hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. To the gold rush and the birth of the Barbary Coast. In January 1848, James W. Marshall discovered gold at Sutter's Mill in Coloma, California. This seemingly small event triggered a global phenomenon, the California Gold Rush, which would transform not just the region but the entire nation. Before the gold rush, San Francisco was little more than a sleepy trading post known as Yerba Buena, home to a few hundred residents. Population was primarily composed of a mix of Mexican Californios, a small number of American settlers, and various indigenous peoples. Life was quiet, and the natural beauty of the Bay Area remained largely untouched. But with the cry of gold, everything changed. The promise of unimaginable wealth drew people from every corner of the globe. They came by ship and by wagon, braving treacherous seas and rugged terrain in a mad dash for the riches that supposedly lay within reach. By the end of 1849, San Francisco had swelled from a modest village to a chaotic boomtown, with a population of over 25,000. This explosion of growth was unprecedented, and the city was wholly unprepared to accommodate the influx of fortune seekers. Streets were crowded with people from diverse backgrounds, Americans from the East Coast, Latin Americans, Europeans, Chinese immigrants, and more. Each group brought its own customs, languages, and ambitions, creating a melting pot of cultures. But what united them all was a single-minded pursuit of gold. For many, the journey to California was not just a quest for wealth but a gamble with destiny. They staked their futures on the hope of striking it rich, and the stakes could not have been higher. As San Francisco grew, so did its need for goods, services, and entertainment. Entrepreneurs and opportunists quickly realized that the surest way to wealth was not necessarily by mining for gold but by catering to those who did. Enter the saloons, gambling dens, boarding houses, and inevitably the brothels. The demand for these establishments was insatiable, and they sprouted up seemingly overnight. Yet with this rapid growth came chaos. San Francisco had no formal law enforcement to speak of, and the existing Mexican legal framework quickly disintegrated under the pressure of American expansion. This vacuum of authority created the perfect environment for the rise of the Barbary Coast. The district took its name from the Barbary Coast of North Africa, a region synonymous with piracy and lawlessness. It was a fitting moniker for a neighborhood that would soon become notorious for its unchecked vice and crime. The Barbary Coast stretched along the waterfront, where ships docked and unloaded their human and material cargoes, providing an endless supply of customers and opportunities for vice. The early days of the Barbary Coast were marked by a wild sense of freedom. It was a place where the rules of the eastern cities didn't apply, where individuals could reinvent themselves or lose themselves entirely. The district attracted not only miners flush with gold but also those who sought to exploit them. Here, fortunes could be made in a single night of gambling, or lost just as quickly in the arms of a prostitute or the grip of an opium pipe. The allure of the Barbary coast was irresistible to many. It offered an escape from the drudgery and dangers of mining, a chance to experience the high life, if only for a fleeting moment. But it was also a place where the darker sides of human nature flourished unchecked. Violence, greed, and vice were as much a part of the district as the gold dust that filtered through its streets. The Barbary coast became a microcosm of the gold rush itself, a world where the pursuit of fortune justified all manner of behavior, and where the line between success and ruin was razor thin. As the city continued to grow, the Barbary coast evolved into a labyrinth of saloons, gambling halls, brothels, and opium dens. Each establishment was a piece of the district's intricate web of vice, contributing to an economy that thrived on excess and exploitation. To understand how the Barbary coast operated, we must delve into the inner workings of its most notorious institutions, starting with the gambling halls that became the heart and soul of the district. 3. The rise of gambling and prostitution. Gambling was the lifeblood of the Barbary coast. In an era where the promise of instant wealth was the driving force behind nearly every action, gambling provided a microcosm of the larger gold rush. Just as miners risked everything on the chance of striking gold, so too did the gamblers of the Barbary coast risk their fortunes on the turn of a card or the roll of the dice. The district's gambling halls became legendary for their opulence, danger, and the sheer scale of money that flowed through them. The gambling halls. At the height of the gold rush, San Francisco boasted more than 1,000 gambling houses. Among the most famous were the Bella Union, the El Dorado, the Parker House, and the Mazorca. Each establishment had its own character and catered to a different clientele, but all shared a common purpose: to part men from their money. The Bella Union, one of the first and most infamous gambling halls, set the standard for luxury and excess. It was more than just a place to gamble. It was a social club, a theater, and a symbol of the Barbary coast's allure. The Bella Union's main gambling floor was a cacophony of sights and sounds. Chandeliers imported from Europe illuminated tables covered with green felt, where fortunes were won and lost on games like faro, monte, roulette, and poker. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and alcohol, and the room buzzed with the excited chatter of men who had come to test their luck. Dealers, often as skilled in sleight of hand as they were with the cards, ensured that the odds always favored the house. But the Bella Union was not the only game in town. The El Dorado was another prominent establishment, known for its lavish interior and high-stakes games. Here, wealthy gamblers could place bets that would make even the most seasoned miners blanch. The walls of the El Dorado were lined with mirrors and gold leaf, reflecting the faces of men who had come to chase their fortunes. The gambling tables were staffed by professional dealers who were adept at keeping the games moving quickly and, more often than not, in the house's favor. While the Bella Union and the El Dorado catered to the city's elite, other establishments like the Parker House and the Mazorca were more accessible to the working class. Parker House, in particular, was known for its rough-and-tumble atmosphere. Here the stakes were lower but the danger was higher. Fights were common, and disputes over debts or cheating often ended in violence. The Mazorca, on the other hand, was a smaller, more discreet operation, favored by those who wished to gamble without drawing too much attention. Games of chance. Faro was the most popular game in the Barbary coast's gambling halls. It was a fast-paced card game with simple rules, making it accessible to both novice and experienced gamblers. However, it was also a game that lent itself to cheating. Dealers used a variety of tricks to ensure that the house had the upper hand, from manipulating the cards to using rigged tables. Yet, despite the risks, Faro was beloved for its excitement and the illusion that anyone could win big. Poker was another favorite, attracting those who prided themselves on their skill and nerve. In the Barbary coast's poker rooms, the stakes could reach astronomical heights. It was not uncommon for a single hand to involve thousands of dollars, a fortune in those days. Players were a mix of miners, businessmen, sailors, and outlaws, each with their own reasons for risking everything on the turn of a card. Tension in these rooms was palpable, and the threat of violence was never far away. Guns were a common accessory at the tables, and a dispute over a bet could quickly escalate into a deadly confrontation. Roulette and dice games like Hazard and Chuck-a-Luck added to the variety of gambling options. The spinning of the roulette wheel and the clatter of dice provided a soundtrack to the district's nightlife. For many, these games represented the essence of the gold rush itself, a gamble against the odds where the outcome was as unpredictable as the search for gold in the hills. Prostitution. While gambling was the Barbary Coast's most visible vice, prostitution was its most lucrative. As the city swelled with men seeking fortune, the demand for female companionship grew. The Barbary Coast responded by becoming one of the largest centers of prostitution on the West Coast. The district offered a range of options, from high-end brothels to the infamous cribs. The brothels of the Barbary Coast were often hidden behind facades that gave the appearance of respectability. Many were disguised as boarding houses, salons, or clubs, where men could enter without drawing too much attention. Inside, the brothels offered a semblance of luxury and refinement. Velvet drapes, plush furnishings, and soft candlelight created an atmosphere of indulgence. The women who worked in these establishments were known as soiled doves, and they were expected to maintain an air of elegance and discretion. They wore elaborate dresses and entertained their clients with music, conversation, and charm. One of the most famous madams of the Barbary Coast was Belle Cora, a woman who rose to prominence through her intelligence, business acumen, and ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of the city. Cora's establishment was known for its exclusivity and its ability to cater to the desires of San Francisco's elite. Belle Cora herself became a figure of legend, embodying the paradoxes of the Barbary Coast, a place where morality was subjective and success could be measured in both wealth and reputation. In stark contrast to the brothels were the cribs, which represented the harshest and most brutal aspect of the Barbary Coast's sex trade. Cribs were small, windowless rooms, often no more than 6 feet by 8 feet in size. They were located in the darker alleys of the district, where the streets were narrow and the air was thick with the smell of refuse. The women who worked in the cribs were often the most vulnerable: immigrants, the destitute, and those who had been coerced or trafficked into the trade. Their lives were a constant struggle for survival, marked by exploitation, disease, and violence. Cribs operated on a brutal economy of scale. The women worked long hours, serving multiple clients in a single night. Price for their services was low, and they were often at the mercy of pimps and brothel owners who controlled every aspect of their lives. The risk of physical harm was ever present, both from clients and from the enforcers who maintained order in the district's underworld. The life expectancy for a woman working in the cribs was tragically short, and many turned to opium or alcohol to numb the reality of their existence. The opium dens. The final piece of the Barbary Coast's vice economy was the opium dens. Opium had been introduced to California by Chinese immigrants, many of whom had come to work on the railroads or in the mines. In the Barbary Coast, opium dens became a fixture, offering an escape from the harsh realities of life in the city. These dens were often located in basements and hidden rooms, accessible only to those who knew where to look. Inside an opium den, the atmosphere was dim and dreamlike. The walls were often adorned with tapestries and lanterns that cast a soft, flickering light. Cushioned mats lined the floors, where patrons reclined with long pipes, inhaling the sweet-smelling smoke. The den was a place of quiet, where the outside world faded away and time seemed to stand still. For many, it was a temporary refuge from the tumult of the Barbary Coast, a place to forget one's troubles and drift into oblivion. Yet, the opium trade was also a source of exploitation and crime. Addiction was rampant, and those who fell into the grip of opium often found themselves trapped in a cycle of dependency and poverty. The dens were frequented not only by those seeking a recreational escape but also by the district's criminal elements, who used them as places to conduct their business away from prying eyes. It was in the opium dens that many of the Barbary Coast's darker dealings were planned and executed. 4 Notorious Figures and Stories. The Barbary Coast was a theater of vice, and every theater needs its players. The district was home to a cast of characters whose exploits became the stuff of legend. They were gamblers, madams, crimps, and gangsters, each contributing to the Barbary Coast's reputation as a place where the rules of society were turned upside down. Shanghai Kelly. Among the most notorious figures was James Shanghai Kelly, a man whose name became synonymous with one of the most feared practices in San Francisco, Shanghaiing. In the days before steamships, the city relied on sailing ships to transport goods and passengers across the Pacific. These ships required large crews, but the life of a sailor was harsh and dangerous. As a result, finding willing men to crew these vessels was difficult, and ship captains turned to the crimps of the Barbary Coast for help. Kelly was one of the most successful crimps in the district. His method was simple yet effective. He owned a saloon where he would invite men for a free drink. Unbeknownst to them, the drink was often laced with a potent drug that would render them unconscious. Once the men were out cold, they were carried through hidden passageways to waiting ships, where they would wake up to find themselves already at sea. Trapped aboard the ship, they had no choice but to work as sailors, often for months or even years. Kelly's most infamous caper occurred in the 1870s when he orchestrated a mass kidnapping that would go down in history. On his birthday, Kelly invited a large group of men to a celebration aboard a ship anchored in the bay. As the men partied and drank, Kelly's accomplices drugged them and loaded them onto several waiting ships. When the men awoke, they found themselves shanghaied, bound for distant ports. It was a masterstroke of criminal ingenuity, and it cemented Kelly's reputation as the most feared crimps on the Barbary Coast. Belle Cora. In contrast to the brutish methods of crimps like Kelly, Belle Cora operated in the shadows of respectability. She was one of the most well-known madams of the Barbary Coast, running a brothel that catered to the city's elite. Cora was a master of maintaining a delicate balance between respectability and vice. Her establishment was a place of discretion, where powerful men could indulge their desires without fear of scandal. Cora's influence extended beyond the walls of her brothel. She was known to use her wealth to support charitable causes, earning her a measure of respect in the community. However, her life was not without tragedy. She fell in love with a gambler named Charles Cora, and their relationship became a cause célèbre when Charles was involved in a fatal duel with a U.S. Marshal. The incident thrust Belle Cora into the public eye, and her efforts to secure Charles's release from jail became a dramatic saga that captivated the city. Despite the scandal, Belle Cora remained a prominent figure in San Francisco until her death, her life a testament to the complex interplay of morality, vice, and power in the Barbary Coast. The Sydney Ducks. Not all of the Barbary Coast's denizens were individuals. Some were groups, like the Sydney Ducks, a gang of Australian ex-convicts who terrorized San Francisco in the early 1850s. The Ducks were known for their brutal methods, which included arson, robbery, and extortion. They preyed upon the city's burgeoning population, targeting businesses and individuals with impunity. The Sydney Ducks' reign of terror eventually led to the formation of the First Vigilance Committee in 1851. Committee was a group of citizens who took the law into their own hands, conducting raids, arrests, and public hangings to restore order. While their actions were controversial, they succeeded in curbing the Ducks' activities and established a precedent for vigilantism in San Francisco, a practice that would resurface in later years as the city continued to grapple with the lawlessness of the Barbary Coast. The Vigilance Committees. The Vigilance Committees were not a single entity but rather a recurring phenomenon in San Francisco's early history. The most famous of these was the 1856 Vigilance Committee, which emerged in response to a wave of crime and political corruption. Committee operated as a de facto government, with its own courts, jails, and militia. Conducted public trials and executions, targeting not just criminals but also corrupt officials and political bosses. While the vigilance committees were credited with restoring order to San Francisco, their methods were often as brutal as those of the criminals they sought to eliminate. They operated outside the bounds of the law, raising questions about the balance between justice and due process. The committee's actions reflected the deep divisions within the city over how to address the Barbary Coast's challenges, a struggle that would continue for decades as San Francisco evolved from a frontier outpost to a modern metropolis. 5. Lawlessness and crime in the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast was a place where crime was not an aberration but a way of life. The district's economy was built on vice, and its streets were a battleground where the strong preyed upon the weak, and the law was often a mere suggestion. Murder, theft, and brawls were common occurrences, and the district's inhabitants navigated this dangerous terrain with a mixture of caution, bravado, and resignation. Murder and mayhem. In the Barbary Coast, life was cheap and death was a frequent visitor. Homicides were so common that they often went unremarked in the city's newspapers, unless they involved a particularly shocking act of violence or a notable figure. The causes of these killings were as varied as the district's denizens: gambling disputes, love triangles, rivalries between gangs, or simply the result of a drunken brawl. One of the most infamous murders was the killing of James King of William, a crusading newspaper editor who had dared to expose the corruption of the city's political elite. King's assassination in 1856 sent shockwaves through San Francisco and galvanized the formation of the Second Vigilance Committee. The committee's swift and public response to King's murder marked a turning point in the city's efforts to bring order to the Barbary Coast, but it also underscored the deep-seated violence that lay at the district's core. Theft and scams. If murder was the district's most violent crime, theft was its most pervasive. Pickpockets, burglars, and con artists operated with impunity in the Barbary Coast. The crowded streets and dimly lit alleys provided the perfect environment for thieves to ply their trade, and the district's gambling halls and saloons were rife with opportunities for deception. One of the most infamous scams was the panel game, a con that involved prostitutes and their accomplices. A man would be lured into a room, where he would be distracted by the woman's attentions. Meanwhile, a hidden panel in the wall would slide open, allowing an accomplice to enter the room and steal the man's valuables. By the time the victim realized what had happened, the thieves were long gone, leaving him to nurse his losses and his pride. Panel game was just one of many cons that thrived in the Barbary Coast. Others included rigged gambling games, counterfeit gold scams, and elaborate schemes to defraud newly arrived immigrants. The district was a place where naivety was swiftly punished, and only the shrewd or the ruthless survived unscathed. The Shanghaiing trade. The practice of Shanghaiing, as exemplified by figures like Shanghai Kelly, was one of the Barbary Coast's most feared criminal enterprises. Men who frequented the district's saloons knew that they risked more than just their money, they risked their freedom. The threat of being drugged, kidnapped, and forced into servitude on a ship was a constant danger, one that added a layer of tension to the district's already volatile atmosphere. Yet, Shanghaiing persisted for decades, a testament to the district's lawlessness and the complicity of those who profited from the trade. Ship captains, saloon owners, and even some law enforcement officials turned a blind eye to the practice, so long as the ships were crewed and the profits flowed. The Barbary Coast was a place where the rules of society were suspended, and where the pursuit of profit often trumped considerations of morality or justice. 6. Transformation and decline. As San Francisco entered the 20th century, the forces that had allowed the Barbary Coast to thrive began to wane. The city was evolving, driven by the pressures of urbanization, industrialization, and the growing demand for reform. Progressive era brought with it a new ethos, one that sought to cleanse cities of their vice-ridden pasts and transform them into orderly, respectable communities. Efforts to reform the Barbary Coast gained momentum in the early 1900s, led by civic leaders, temperance advocates, and law enforcement officials who saw the district as a blight on the city's reputation. They launched campaigns to shut down gambling halls, brothels, and opium dens, using a combination of legal action, public shaming, and police raids to achieve their goals. The once thriving establishments of the Barbary Coast were forced to close or move underground, their gaudy facades replaced by a veneer of respectability. The 1906 earthquake and fire, which devastated much of San Francisco, also played a role in the Barbary Coast's decline. The disaster leveled large portions of the district, providing an opportunity for city officials to rebuild with a different vision. As the city rose from the ashes, the Barbary Coast was transformed. Its former haunts were replaced by new developments, and the district's most notorious figures faded into memory. While the physical traces of the Barbary Coast disappeared, its legacy remained. It became a part of San Francisco's lore, a reminder of a time when the city was a wild frontier where anything was possible, and where the pursuit of fortune often came at a high cost. The Barbary Coast's history is a testament to the complexities of human nature, a story of ambition, desire, and the thin line that separates order from chaos. 7. Conclusion. The Barbary Coast is a chapter of American history that captures the spirit of an era when the quest for wealth and adventure drove men to the farthest corners of the earth. It was a place of contradictions, a district where vice and virtue coexisted, where fortunes could be won or lost in an instant, and where the law was an afterthought. In the Barbary Coast, the American dream and the American nightmare were two sides of the same coin, and every person who walked its streets had to decide how far they were willing to go to achieve their desires. In this episode, we've explored the rise and fall of the Barbary Coast, delving into the lives of its most notorious figures and the events that shaped its legacy. From the gold seekers who flocked to San Francisco in search of fortune to the gamblers, prostitutes, and criminals who made the district their own, the Barbary Coast was a place where the extremes of human behavior were on full display. But the story of San Francisco's underworld doesn't end here. In our next episode, we'll unravel the mystery of one of the city's most bizarre and chilling crimes, the infamous death by chocolate murder. It's a case that defies belief, filled with intrigue, deception, and a deadly treat that left a trail of death in its wake. If you have any questions, comments, or stories of your own to share, please reach out to us at serenia@gmail.com. We love hearing from our listeners and welcome any suggestions for future episodes. Until next time, I'm I and have a good night.